Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hey Richard, good to see you. How are you?
I'm not too bad. How are you today, Jen?
I'm excited. Glad to be here for another episode of Maritime Matters. Recording this on Friday, the 12th of July, so if something exciting in maritime happens, which I'm sure it will, in the next 24 hours. That's why we haven't talked about it. It always does. Absolutely maritime matters.
Most importantly, Jen, I've got to talk about your shirt. What have you got? What for those of us who are not watching us on YouTube? What pleasures are they missing out by not doing so?
Well, it is a brilliant shirt, but it is a shirt of a map. Unfortunately, it's Europe, not the Indo-Pacific, but still, it looks very cool. And I wore it because today I was giving a lecture about borders and maritime zones and Operation Sovereign Borders, so it seemed appropriate. But also, you had to wear it for Maritime Matters. So, double. I can get you one if you want, Richard. They're in the female section.
I think it'd go down a treat with my students.
Great. It's fantastic. So, Richard, what have you been up to this week?
So I've been preparing for teaching, and which is starting next week. So that's always joyous. And I've been involved in the trench warfare going on social media about AUKUS. And I had a piece out earlier in the week or in the AFR, again talking about AUKUS. What else? And sort of contributing to the wider debate which is going on. Which the Fin Review's trying to sort of foster and generate lots and lots of controversy over. So that's been my week.
And there has been lots. What are the key points of your AUKUS op-ed in about 20 seconds?
So I was trying to do what I'd initially called a balance sheet. Obviously, they always change the title. Whenever you write an op-ed and you come up with a good title, they always then change it.
Yes.
So I called it the AUKUS balance sheet. I tried to make the case that actually a lot of the arguments so far have either been polarized completely one side or completely the other, and I tried to set out that there are actually very strong arguments for AUKUS, and tried to talk a little bit about some of those within Australia's sort of why it matters for Australian national security, but at the same time also highlight some of the challenges and acknowledge some of the issues that I think the James Curran set of articles the week before did point out about the difficulties in the way in which AUKUS came about, which we talked about on last week's podcast. So I tried to sort of set it up on one side and then the other, and also talk about the problems that would come now from cancelling it, because I think there's quite a lot of negativity around AUKUS, but not many people actually talk about what would happen if you did now cancel it, which I think is got to be part of that conversation. So have a look, check it out.
It is definitely worthwhile reading. It was a really good piece. And even though I'm breaking with our normal kind of canter for the thing, I just want to touch on that negativity around AUKUS, because I did a bit of a deep dive this week into public polling and public perceptions of AUKUS, having sat on a panel at the National Security College this week talking about AUKUS. And actually, there's two good polls out, both USSC's poll from last year and Lowy's poll from this year, which do actually say, despite the pushes in the media, the majority of Australians, based on those polling, both of them had respective sample sizes for Australia's population. The majority of Australians actually support AUKUS.
Yep.
Or at least don't strongly disagree with AUKUS. So it's a bit of a mismatch between, I think, the gotcha media reporting on AUKUS and the average Australian. Now, of note, that view does seem to change when the question is asked in a way of, do you think it's good value for money? But the majority of support AUKUS.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing in terms of both sides, but particularly those and places like the ASA thinking about this, is that I think the polling broadly does show support for AUKUS, but that support is not particularly deep. So there's actually relatively few people saying they really support AUKUS. There's quite a lot of people think, yeah, broadly it vaguely makes sense, but that the potential for scope for that to change perhaps greater than on other issues. So I think there's still a large, relatively undecided middle within this sort of wider discussion. So I think I would generally agree with you. I think that the public mood is more positive than the media coverage, but I think we need to take the strength of that with a degree of a pinch of salt.
I think you're right. So, Richard, big week. Chief of Defence Force handed over. So, lots of aircraft flying through the skies of General Angus Campbell. He handed over to now Admiral David Johnston. First time Navy has had a Chief of Defence Force in quite some time. When was the last time Navy had a Chief of Defence Force, Richard? Good trivia question.
The last Navy CDF was Admiral Chris Barry from 1998-2002. So really long time ago when you think about the kind of issues confronting the incoming CDF in 1998. Very different set of issues today. So it's been a long time and coming. So hopefully, and I think that probably points to wider shifts in terms of focus within.
All right. Okay. So Richard, what else? Richard, what else has been happening in the region this week?
So, in terms of sort of maritime matters, things happening. One of the news stories, which is that caught my attention, was the arrival of the attack Cavour, and taking sort of part in Pitch Black, which for those people who are sort of focused, this is a light blue primarily, not something we normally talk a huge. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time a carrier has been involved in exercise Pitch Black, so that's exciting. So this is the first time a carrier has been. It's a sort of significant general kind of multinational exercise, particularly notable European contingent. So in carrier, along with escort, there's also a significant Italian force contribution, as well as a German, Spanish contribution and UK. So sort of Europe and NATO is Pitch Black, and I think this fits into sort of narratives around the focus on the Indo-Pacific within NATO. Obviously, NATO has a lot of its own region, but this is still for NATO. War is going to be going on to operate with the Japanese a little bit later on, and then I think coming back through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and so we'll probably be seeing a fair bit more in our region.
Yeah, so it is great to have an aircraft carrier Pitch Black. Since we are maritime, not just naval issues, we probably should say that I think this is the largest Pitch Black ever. It's certainly got over 16 countries, 4,000 personnel, 140 aircraft. Pitch Black, Pitch Black's an exercise has been going for about 40 years. However, it's only really, I think, in the last 10 years, maybe 15, that started to expand like this. And I think notably, actually, we mentioned the huge European contingent, but actually for the first time, there's also Philippines fighter aircraft participating in Pitch Black, which I think is good in terms of regional engagement.
Yeah, that also speaks to some of the growing capabilities in the region and growing awareness of some of the issues and opportunities that exercises, particularly Australian-based exercises, offer in lots of these sorts of.
Yeah, and in fact, I think I saw an interview with a senior officer, maybe from Italy, but either way, just talking about the training space available in Australia. And so Australia, we know, is sought after by many countries to undertake training. So yeah, great to see Pitch Black. Now, also, lots happening this week. So obviously, there's the NATO Washington Summit, 75th anniversary of NATO, the communique's out. We won't delve into it because it's not particularly maritime. But also, there's some interesting reporting this week about a Japanese destroyer entering Chinese territorial waters. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I'm gonna pull this one over to you because this is definitely your space than mine. Right. I had some initial thoughts but I'm gonna at least let you first stab before I make a.
I think this is interesting in the fact that it was actually reported on. So reports that a Japanese destroyer has entered Chinese territorial waters. Now, of course, we know that under the innocent passage regime, under UNCLOS, ships of all descriptions, including warships, can enter territorial waters so long as they're conducting continuous and expeditious passage. Now, China does have a rule where they require warships to advise them when they're entering their territorial waters, but most countries don't comply with that because it's not recognised, it's not consistent with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So I think it's interesting that it was actually reported on as an issue in Japanese media, and some of the reporting, so the Kyoto media outlet actually said that there was going to be a JMSDF investigation into this, and that they were talking to the CEO of the ship. So, despite the fact that Japanese warships can transit through Chinese territorial waters in accordance with international law, it seems to be potentially an issue in Japan that they may not have actually had approval for this, or there might be a policy around avoiding this. So, look, the interesting thing for me is the fact that it even made the news. What's your take on it?
Oh yeah, like I am not an expert on UNCLOS, but very much both the rights that warships have to do this, and also quite a lot of the kind of domestic legislation that is in place in quite a lot of other countries are supposed to at least have warning given of territory. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I'd be wrong on this, but this is not something that the Japanese Navy do regularly. It's seen raised as an issue, particularly if you think that the Chinese are very vocal when these kind of things, various different parts of the region. So if it was something that happened regularly and was part of a policy, expected to have seen something more frequent, or sort of frequent report, things like that. So it does mean that this was unintended. Cause other questions in terms of how does this actually happen, and that seems to fit with some of the investigation. Now, I think obviously in terms of UNCLOS, the rights to do this are there. I think that it's perhaps not the best way to go about those rights to do so unplanned kind of a way. That would be my kind of take on this, but it's something that I think is just interesting, and we'll have to see if anything more creeps out in terms of quite what happened. And
yeah, absolutely. And again, as we described this, I've made the assumption that the vessel was transiting. Of course, if it is not transiting and it's loitering, then that actually is in breach of the innocent passage regime. So look, we'll see what
I think it was only in
20 minutes is the reporting. Yeah.
So loitering, and I don't know quite what they could have been doing in terms of if they were engaged in military activity. That changes some of lots of unknowns.
It is interesting. Moving on to, I guess, capability, right? So there's been a bit developing in capability in the last week. I think the first thing, I am sick of talking about AUKUS on this podcast, but we do need to talk about it one more time because there has been some good news this week. So we've seen the first officer cohort graduate from the UK nuclear course, which is fantastic. In fact, an Australian topped that nuclear course, which is, good for the PR, Lieutenant Isabella. So that's fantastic. Good to see a Australian submariner topping that course the first time around.
To crew a lot of these vessels. In terms of the wider training pipeline, I think it's obviously really good to see this happening. It's great to see the connections as well as in the US. And from a purely pragmatic basis, it's also good to see more people in terms of personnel and British submarine capability. They crew their submarines. Having trained and sort of Australian personnel into that capability pipeline, I'm sure is something that the RN is in certain regards very grateful for. Let's just hope they can keep enough boats operational that they can actually continue to support that.
Absolutely. And I think also with this early training of Australian submariners through both the US and the UK, it'll also be important for us to be able to retain these submariners until we get our nuclear-powered submarines in the early 30s. But look, that's probably enough on AUKUS. So let's talk on to the other exciting capability announcement in the last couple of years for the Royal Australian Navy, which is Project C3000.
Take me a while to get used to this. There's sort of 1000 C4.
Yeah, me too. In fact, I've got to be honest. I think one of the things I liked about, so I think we owe Ben Felton a kudos in his ADM piece this week. I think a lot of people, it was the most detail they have seen about Project C3000. But it gave a good rundown of where Australia is at with selecting its general purpose frigate and some of the things that are rumoured to make up the selection criteria. What did you take away from this piece?
Yeah, so definitely worth a read. He pulls out a lot of useful stuff from that he's managed to get out of the department, but also from Senate estimates, which was a couple of weeks ago. And again, there is some quite interesting stuff in the transcripts there. Really dig down and be nerdy. But the main focus is on kind of the question about shifting away from what I would describe as Australianized military off-the-shelf design to be built in a kind of traditional Australian way of warships towards something that is a straight military with no modifications. And quite a lot of detail in the piece about quite what that means. A lot of us have been, frankly, about whether or not that's certainly going to be a massive shift as in terms of the RAN or defence more generally procures vessels. So real sort of detail on what that, or a bit more what that means, the degree of kind of no changes. So that the was that only the only changes, the statement from Rear Admiral Hughes, that the changes, I think, so obviously anything that's in Japanese or Korean or things we need to other than that, all other changes go through and then up to be approved. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be any changes to design, put some pretty significant brakes on that, and also statements about the fact that 4 is an out-of-the-box solution, and of a full pipeline, even down to out-of-the-box solution. Now, see this, I think it's a dramatic shift. I have questions. I think there's a lot of questions that this poses. Really interesting to see a lot more detail on this, and yeah.
So I guess it kind of made the hairs on my neck stand up a little bit. So when Ben kind of pulls out the bits from Senate estimates, it's very clear that this is a government-directed policy of minimal changes. It's certainly not no changes. I mean, it just will not be no changes. There are Australian safety standards the vessels will need to comply with. So I found the comment reportedly from Admiral Hughes in the estimates that, the only change allowed without going to the Defence Committee is actually change to language. Really means the Defence Committee is going to be looking at a lot of minor things. And I guess I've got two broad takeaways from it that kind of made the hairs on my neck stand up. I think the first one is, have we gotten to this point with defence capability, or at least defence naval capability, where the government doesn't trust defence? Right, and you might say, well, that's a long bow to draw, but it seems odd, given all of the committees to do with capability within defence, including IC, who would normally make decisions, that it needs to go to the Defence Committee to make minor changes to a vessel. Right, so I think the first one is this, and this is a government-directed policy, it looks like from the commentary in estimates. I've got no particular insight. So are we at the point where the government is not trusting? That's concerning, right? I think the second bit from it is, for me, one of my challenges at the moment when people talk about workforce in defence is that there's this, what do we do about workforce? Recruitment and retention, how do we solve this? Is too hard. And I often think that that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that when you look at workforce in defence, you're actually looking at a problem that's a capacity problem, right? And I've said this in a few different forums. Workforce is one lever of capacity, right? But so is process, so is structure, so is the capabilities you require and how workforce intensive they are. So it concerns me a little bit, this degree of micromanagement that a defence committee would be approving changes to vessels, minor changes that will need to be made for safety standards and for sustainment. And we're looking at that capacity issue and we're saying, hey, we've got this huge workforce problem. But one of the ways we solve that is by reducing processes so we can get more capacity out of our workforce. But we're actually creating more laborious processes. What is really should be a straightforward acquisition of a ship. So they're my two concerns, right? How much micromanagement is this actually endorsing, and what does that mean for the wider Defence Force structure? And what does it mean about government's trust in defence? Now, I might be reading too much into it, but it is quite odd to hear these statements from estimates, the head of Navy capabilities saying, well, we need to go to the Defence Committee to change anything apart from so that's concerning.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to put my kind of other hat on, I would say I completely agree with you, but I also don't think that's really. I think where you've only got to look the kind of defence, particularly naval acquisition, and read the audit office reports and things like that. Okay, well, this should be decisions made at investment committee. Defence can't produce the documents to show what happened at investment committee, right? So we don't even know how they made the decisions that they've made half the time at the moment. So I'm not really that surprised that government doesn't trust defence with quite a lot of this sort of thing, which is a conclusion I would also think makes a lot of sense. I also think that if you think back to in terms of the surface fleet review and the clear battles that happened within government coming out of the surface fleet review a long time after government was before it was actually released, and we got some inklings of the fact there was quite within government about this and about getting money for this. I would not be at all surprised to see part of that being defence can be trusted to spend this money appropriately. And I think that this fits into that kind of narrative. So, absolutely right, but I don't really see that necessarily. Is it a problem? Yes. But then SAR talks about at some length. And we've seen relatively little, certainly publicly, in terms of has been. So I can't see from an outsider's sort of civilian perspective and a taxpayer's perspective, this is as being quite perhaps as surprising as that.
No, look, I would agree. I don't necessarily see it as surprising, but I do see it as concerning, right? When we're talking about there's no such thing as strategic warning time, and we're saying that a bunch of defence experts need to go to the Defence Committee for those changes. I think the other point, though, just on the history of defence projects, I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I think actually there is a lot of successful history of defence projects in Australia. Now, nobody says this. It's easy to be critical, and it's certainly easy to be critical when you have the Hunter-class ANAO audit released in 2023 staring you in the face, and, Arafura offshore patrol vessel, which in the public sphere nobody's quite sure why it was launched a number of years ago and hasn't yet been commissioned. But there are successful defence projects as well. And I guess my comment to if government feels that they need to micromanage that much with all these approvals going through the Defence Committee as per government direction, then you've got to ask the question that if they think there have been that many issues with Defence's acquisition, which I actually don't agree with, I just think there's some really obvious public ones right now, then why has nobody been held accountable? Now, we won't delve into this too badly, but, if it is that bad, nobody has been held accountable, right? And you look at, not that I agree with the US system and how they publicly name and shame, I don't support that, but if things are that bad, then nobody's been sacked. Anyway, I'll probably leave that point where it is. There's one other point that I wanted to draw out from Ben's excellent article. Ben outlined what he thought were going to be the selection criteria, which is actually slightly different to what I thought was going to be the selection criteria. Had I had to rank the selection criteria, I would have said the first selection criteria would be risk. So risk to the platform. So who can deliver the platform that is the most proven? I would have thought the second selection criteria would have been schedule risk. So who has the industrial capability or capacity to build the ship? The first one coming into commission in 2029. And I would have thought the third criteria would have been strategic relationship, with the fourth being the ability to scale that work and build it in Australia. That's what I would have said. Now, Ben said that they understand at ADM that the order criteria for selection is the first one being the ability to commence construction into 2026. So actually schedule risk taking more importance than capability risk, which I thought was interesting. Their ability to transfer the design to Australia. So I would have ranked the strategic relationship above that selection criteria, but that's apparently number 2. Number 3 is the ability to be maintained in Australia. Now, that's pretty straightforward, unless you're talking about commonality of supply chains, because one of the concerns about the limited changes rhetoric around the general purpose frigate is, are you going to introduce a new missile system? Are you going to introduce a new gun, right? These are things that if you map out how you design a navy, these are things that you just don't do. So that was number 3. And then the fourth one was their compliance with regulatory class and legislative standards of Australia. Right, none of them are going to comply, to be honest. And then the final one was interoperability with Australian allied systems. And I thought that was interesting that that's actually the final scenario. What are your takes on that?
Yeah, so it's in line with what bits and pieces I've heard, and it fits with the kind of the narrative that from the Surface Fleet Review, as I saw it, that capability in the water is top priority, right? And the idea of the building these, so the ability to build them in the water in the time frame required is and other things like compatibility with existing Australian systems, like training is a huge and certification of things like engineers and people to be working on propulsion systems, and also you want to try and generate as much commonality across the fleet as possible. Systems, a whole host of issues that come out from an entirely different vessel into the mix. Making much lower priority. Now, this is where my raised eyebrows about this approach come from. Yes, there are massive issues with the Australianisation that they see in quite a lot of recent Australian warship procurement projects. But behind is quite a lot of this, right? And I think we were both on a little while ago, which the ANI ran, and former Chief of Navy, Noonan, quite a bit in terms of he gave a comment talking about the different platforms you would be running and the number of different systems that might and the massive challenges that will. So I understand it's happening. I think to a degree it's to me that actually there's even greater concern about the strategic environment than perhaps is understood, right? They just want some water because something's better than nothing. And perhaps also more concern about the Anzacs and the ability of the Anzacs to continue perform the roles they are performing into the future. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, but I think there are some very significant questions.
I agree, right? And I just go back to my framing of the workforce problem as not a workforce problem, but a capacity problem, of which workforce is one lever. Well, if you think about that capacity problem and you're introducing ships that don't have commonality of systems of supply chains, et cetera, then you are just worsening that problem. And maybe you're right. Maybe it is because of the understanding of the strategic situation. Although I am still not convinced that we couldn't have had a ship earlier than 2029. So maybe it is, but maybe it's also the embarrassment of the fact that we're saying the fleet is growing, but actually the fleet is reducing. I mean, that's the facts between now and the early 2030s. So maybe it's that as well. But a fleet that is slightly growing, just moving on to the US. Talking of a fleet that's expanding, I mean, this is not that interesting, but the US have just taken delivery of a new guided missile destroyer, the USS John Basilone, so a new Arleigh Burke. And I think just worth noting, given the constant commentary about the US's ability to build ships, any comments on the new USS John Basilone?
So I'm not sure she's officially named yet, but the continued production of the Arleigh, and I think it's from Bath Iron Works off the top.
Yep, that's correct.
And a pine of further down the line. So there's significant sort of momentum behind the Arleigh Burke program, and obviously this has been going since the very early 1990s. And there is a drive to try and turn the water, which is good to see, particularly the growth of PLAN numbers. There are ongoing questions what's going to happen with DDGX, and whether or not that lead to sort of come to fruition. But in the meantime, the American industrial base is slowly but surely, I think you can see signs of it turning around. And hopefully we'll see the kind of the Arleigh Burke drumbeat pick up a little bit more, because they are very much the backbone of not only fleet, but also more widely of any kind of US-led coalition in the Indo-Pacific, just in terms of numbers. They're by far the most important surface combatants around.
Absolutely, and also taking into account the fact that it looks like the US future frigate is now delayed. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 years, but absolutely. Now, other fleets that are expanding, everybody's very excited about Canadian submarines. Richard, what's come out about Canadian submarines? I'm excited about Canadian submarines.
I was going to say, we're in a minority of about 2.
I did see a number of Australian commentators, not informed ones, say this is another example of why Australia doesn't need nuclear-powered submarines, because Canada has chosen not to. And of course, when we look at Canada's problem, strategic problem in terms of being able to operate under the ice, nuclear-powered makes sense. But I don't think it's because Canada didn't want nuclear-powered submarines. I think it's either because they're not going to get the technology from the US, or they can't afford them. But anyway, sorry, Richard.
Yes, so there was a couple of months ago some forth and question marks after particularly odd comments in Trudeau about whether or not Canada was going to be joining AUKUS Pillar 1, which sort of minor flurry of excitement among us. I think it was never really on the cards, and the Ministry of Defence quickly statements basically said the Prime Minister wasn't entirely informed in what he said. The idea of the Canadian replacement program for their Victoria were originally British class that were commissioned in the kind of early 1990s, designed in the transferred to the Canadians, I think in the early 2000s. Yep. And they've been a problematic capability, I think it's fair to say, for some time. And this is the replacement for them. And it's going to be supposedly at least 12 conventionally powered submarines, a $60 billion Canadian dollar project. So a hefty whack of cash. Although I'm always very dubious about trying to comparing a Canadian program with an Australian program with a British program when we're very much talking about apples, oranges, and pears. One of the key things about this is range, and particularly, as you say, under ice capability. So we'll have to see a little bit more about that as the details come through. I think most of the Western global submarine constructing firm lips at this one. I've got a lot of talk from Saab about being very interested in this program. Mess with, I think, their joint and Norwegian line, if memory serves. But also it's the French and potentially things like the Japanese and South Koreans as well. And the South Koreans certainly are very interested in this this contract. So big announcement. I'm not sure that there's much money as of yet. So I haven't element of it that closely, but I know only a little while ago there was a lot of talk and not a lot of money for a little while. So I think this could be a saga that runs on for quite some time. But there's been a lot of commitment and defence spending and everything else. So give credit where credit's due. The sign that Canada.
Yeah, look, I agree. So Canada is one of the countries that in NATO that is below the 2% defence spending cap. So I think a couple of years ago there were 5 countries that were above 2%. Now it's about 23 of the 32 NATO countries, but Canada is still below. There's been a discussion moving into the Washington summit. I think there were some Canadian analysts that thought there might have been a defence budget announcement in the lead up to the Washington summit, but there hasn't been. So there is a real question, I think, about Canada's ability to afford all of these upgrades that they have been announcing, because this is one of a series of upgrades to capabilities across their defence force that they've announced. I think it's positive for Canada, not much of a surprise. I mean, Canada really didn't have a submarine capability for a long time.
I think that's probably all we've gone for today. Keep an eye on, there's lots of other things going on, particularly outside of our region. So interesting things happening again, still in the red elsewhere, that we've not got time for this time, and we might hopefully come back to and talk about a little bit more next time round. But I think that's probably all.